As the wind howled fiercely, my father's voice thundered, declaring, "You're not my child anymore. Get out." He stood at the door, his expression twisted with rage, believing I had stolen $5 million from the family business. I fell to the muddy ground, rain soaking my clothes, protesting hoarsely, "Dad, I didn't do it. Please listen to me." Lightning cracked against the window, but he remained unmoved. He tossed my suitcase into a puddle, splashing dirty water over me, as though they had premeditated this act. Peeking through the kitchen window, the maids whispered among themselves, shadows flickering in dim light. I reached out for the suitcase, but Vivian stepped forward, obstructing my path. Holding my late mother's wedding ring, which she'd extracted from the safe, Vivian tossed it at my face, sneering, You don't deserve a damn thing." The ring cut my forehead, blood mingling with rain. Before I could rise, my half-brother shoved me toward the gate, assaulting my side with a harsh kick. "Get out, you thief," he spat. Meanwhile, Aunt Susan stood clutching her necklace, shouting over the storm, "Go die with your mother." With one final push, Ethan flung open the gate, thrusting me onto the street. I called out to my father for trust, but he retreated inside, the door closing firmly, excluding me from the only home I'd known. The rain unrelenting, I crawled to the suitcase, finding its contents soaked. Photos, clothes, and my ID were drenched. They'd orchestrated this setup. A week ago, the company ledger bore my name forged by another. Attempting to warn my father fell on deaf ears. Vivian had ensnared him since my mother's death, turning everything, including my father, against me to favor Ethan with a house, business, and Carter name. Susan complicitly aided their schemes, likely the one behind the forged papers. That night, I struggled through relentless rain, the streetlight dimming as the storm consumed everything. Dragging the suitcase heavy with rain, I moved aimlessly. By morning, the downpour slowed, leaving me shivering under a dilapidated gas station's awning. Inside, I used my last $5 on a bitter coffee and stale donut, sitting outside, clutching my mother's ring as my only possession. The subsequent weeks became a desperate blur. Securing a cramped, roach-infested apartment on town's outskirts, I paid rent by pawning my watch. Waiting tables at a grimy highway diner paid little, and the clients were unpleasant. During a shift, a trucker grabbed my arm, saying, "Sweetheart, you look like hell." I retorted sharply, despite my boss's glare. A woman later left no tip, writing "loser" on a napkin. I worked doubles, barely eating, always hungry enough to silence my growling stomach. A month later, walking home after a late shift, an old sedan's driver offered quick cash for moving packages. Desperate with rent due, I accepted. But in an alley behind a warehouse, his true intentions revealed. He grabbed my hair, intent to harm. Panic surged, and I drew a rusty knife, slashing his arm. He cursed, releasing me, and I fled, my shoulder bleeding profusely. I hid in a dumpster, trembling in the dark. A week later, nursing a beer in a dingy bar, seeking solitude, I met Jack. He sat beside me, a wiry man in his 30s, exclaiming, "Looks like you've been through some shit," lighting a cigarette. I merely shrugged. He revealed that his name was Jack, mentioning he once dealt in stocks on Wall Street. A disastrous deal had wiped him out, but he was back, picking winners in the market, and he saw potential in me as a partner. He emphasized the importance of defeating those who think they're superior. Smoking a cigarette, he said he could show me the way. Initially, I was skeptical, having nothing left to risk. I shared my story about my father's betrayal and the unjust framing I endured. We both aimed for the same goal, rebirth and retribution against those who underestimated us. We shook hands, and the game commenced. Jack started mentoring me in the financial game. We would rendezvous at a library downtown using free computers. He taught me to interpret stock charts, discern patterns, and invest in undervalued companies. Immersing myself in numbers, my eyes tired from staring at the screen, I soaked up every lesson. After several months, I left the diner, combining my savings with Jack's for our first investment. We wagered on a struggling tech company teetering on the brink of collapse. I nearly withdrew when the stock plummeted, but Jack, with calm assurance, urged me to hang on. 2 weeks later, the company secured a vital contract, causing the stock to soar. We pocketed enough for rent and more. Months passed, and I found myself smiling for the first time in ages. Our adventure continued. My knowledge grew. I became bolder. Jack and I rented a modest office, just a desk and 2 laptops, monitoring markets day in and day out. We encountered a setback one year, losing half our funds on a misstep. I was ready to walk away, but Jack's resolve wouldn't waver. "You're not a quitter, Evelyn. You're a fighter," he emphasized, placing a coffee in front of me. We took a calculated risk, investing everything in a failing energy firm. I discovered a loophole in their debt records, pitching the idea to a buyer Jack knew, and we flipped it for thrice the amount. That success put us on the map. Over the coming years, we built something substantial. A financial firm that bore my name. I employed a team, rented a stylish downtown office, and watched the money roll in. Jack remained my confidant, the only one I trusted. A decade passed in that manner. Standing in my office, drink in hand, gazing at the city skyline, I realized how much I had changed. No longer the Evelyn that struggled in the alley, I had transformed scars into strength, hunger into affluence. My company was now a multi-million-dollar empire I controlled. Jack entered, throwing his jacket onto a chair. "You've come a long way," he remarked, pouring a drink. I acknowledged, eyeing my mother's ring on my desk. Yet it still wasn't enough. "Dad, Vivian, Ethan, Susan." Raised to think I'd disappear, they underestimated me. I put down my glass, glanced at Jack. "It's time for them to pay," I declared. He grinned, raising his glass. "Let's make it count." Jack and I kicked into gear after that office night. 10 years of clawing upwards, converting hardship into strength, now prepared for use. Targeting Susan and Ethan first, they played key roles in the scheme that left me to fend for myself in the storm. Over the years, I followed their exploits through news articles, whispers Jack gathered from former acquaintances. Susan, holding on to her family wealth, still lived in her old house, while Ethan rose to CEO of Carter Industries, exuding arrogance. They believed I was gone. Their error was about to be exposed. I began with Susan. Always superstitious, she was easily rattled, clutching her ominous charms. I remembered her childhood taunts that claimed my mother's ghost would curse my existence. Her fears would work against her now. Unearthed copies of forged ledger pages, used against me, became my revenge. Jack's contact uncovered these old records, and I mailed her fragments of them. Each letter contained a forgery of my signature and a message in crimson ink. "Your blood will pay." Initially, she'd remain ignorant of my involvement. Then, hiring a shady figure, I had him call her at midnight, silently whispering, "Can you hear Evelyn's mother yet?" and hanging up. A week later, Jack informed me Susan stopped leaving her home, windows shrouded tight, murmuring about apparitions in mirrors. Events escalated as she, in panic, contacted a psychic, a faith she maintained, believing they could fend off unseen threats. Unbeknownst to her, the hired psychic was my employee, paid double what she offered for cooperation. Portraying a sage-chanting mystic, he convinced her a Carter family curse haunted her. He guaranteed relief if she transferred her assets. The money was tainted, fueling the curse. She transferred everything to a shell company I created, bank accounts included. Once that was settled, I drove over to her place. When she opened the door, she was pale and trembling. I walked in without speaking. I tossed a pile of forged ledgers onto her coffee table. "You taught me survival, Susan," I said in a monotone voice. "Now I'm showing you how to endure hell." She screamed and lunged at me, but I simply walked out as she crumpled, sobbing about ghosts. A month passed, and I learned she'd boarded up her house and cut off all communication. She was effectively gone, trapped within her own mind. Next up was Ethan, who wouldn't go quietly. He had taken over our father's company and treated it like his personal playground, dismissing loyal employees and pocketing bonuses. For years, I had been quietly buying up shares of Carter Industries through front companies to keep my involvement hidden. Jack took care of the details, managing the numbers while I bided my time. The opportunity presented itself at an annual shareholder meeting. I entered the boardroom in a black suit, my hair pulled back, and took my place at the table. Ethan didn't even notice me until the voting commenced. I had secured enough shares to influence the agenda, and when the chairman called for motions, I stood. I moved to remove Ethan Carter as CEO, effective immediately, I declared, my voice cutting through the silence. The room froze, and Ethan's face turned a livid red as he slammed the table with his fist. "Who the hell are you?" he shouted, veins bulging in his neck. Locking eyes with him, I replied, "I'm the nightmare you created." I resumed my seat as the vote passed. He was out, but he didn't take it lying down. 2 nights later, while driving home from the office, a black SUV veered into my lane. The driver ran me off the road, and I escaped my car only to be attacked by 2 hooded men. One lunged with a knife aimed at my chest, but I ducked, elbowing his jaw. The other grabbed me from behind, and I stomped on his foot to break free. I dashed into the woods, heart racing, until I lost them. Jack found me an hour later, his truck idling on a secluded road. "Ethan's behind this," he said, handing me a burner phone. He had tracked the plates and found they were linked to someone Ethan knew from college. We avoided involving the police. Instead, Jack arranged a meeting with one of the hitmen, offering them money to flip sides. The man confessed everything on video, naming Ethan as the man who hired him to end my life. I posted the footage online the next morning, tagging every news outlet possible. By noon, police swarmed Ethan's house, arresting him. Headlines blasted accusations of fraud and attempted murder. He was sentenced to life without parole. Before they locked him up, I mailed him a blank check with a note, "Welcome to the hell I lived in." That night, I watched the news in my office, Jack leaning against my desk with a drink in hand. Susan was shattered. Ethan's downfall was complete. Jack looked at me and asked, "You all right?" His tone was casual, but his eyes were sharp. I nodded, watching Ethan's mugshot flash on the screen. "Yeah." I kept my reply brief. Seeing them fall felt rewarding, but it was insufficient. Vivian and Dad were still untouched, living as if nothing had happened. I turned off the TV and reached for my coat. "We're not finished yet," I told Jack. He downed his beer and followed me out. The confrontation wasn't over. 2 targets remained, Vivian and Dad. Susan was a hollow shell. Ethan was languishing in prison. It was their turn next. I had spent years crafting my power base in preparation for this moment, and every move needed to count. Vivian was still luxuriating in what was left of the Carter fortune, pretending innocence. Dad was isolated in a retirement home, a shadow of the man who had cast me out. I wasn't just aiming to ruin them. I wanted them to feel every agonizing second. Vivian was my starting point. She had orchestrated the plan that framed me for stealing $5 million. I had Jack delve into old company records, and we found evidence of her skimming funds for years, offshore accounts, fake invoices, the lot. I anonymously sent all this information to the press, with enough evidence to ignite a scandal. Within days, the media was abuzz with reports of her fraud, and federal agents froze her bank accounts. Her luxurious home was auctioned off, and her so-called friends abandoned her swiftly. I thought that was the end, but Vivian retaliated fiercely. She filed a lawsuit against me, accusing me of fabricating the evidence to frame her. Her attorneys were skilled, securing a judge's warrant, and soon, I found myself in handcuffs outside my office, detained for questioning. As Jack yelled, "Hang on, we'll fix this," I was pushed into a patrol car, and things worsened. Vivian had associates within the jail. She bribed some inmates to harass me while I awaited trial. On the first night, 2 women cornered me in the cell block. One held my arms while the other punched my stomach. "This is from your stepmother." She landed another punch on my jaw, hissing "Mom" as she did. I retaliated by kicking one in the knee and slamming my elbow into the other's nose. Despite my efforts, they kept coming at me. It wasn't until the guards broke it up that I finally got some relief, though I was left bruised and bleeding, my lips split open. During those 3 weeks, I dodged attacks and slept with one eye open. Meanwhile, on the outside, Jack was working tirelessly, calling in every favor he could. He managed to locate an old recording from a party years back. Vivian, drunk on champagne, had bragged about how she'd altered the books to get rid of me. Jack got this to my lawyer, and we presented it in court. The judge's expression turned cold as Vivian's voice played through the speakers, and the entire case turned around. The charges against me were dropped, while Vivian faced 20 years for fraud and conspiracy. Once released, I was finally free, with my name cleared. A week afterward, I visited Vivian in prison. She sat across from me in an orange jumpsuit, glaring defiantly. I pulled out her wedding ring, worn during her years with Dad, which I had repurchased from auction, and threw it in her face. I told her, "You said I didn't deserve anything," as it bounced off her cheek and clattered on the floor. "You've lost, Vivian. I've got everything you wanted." She lunged at the glass, screaming threats at me, but I turned and left, her curses echoing behind me. As I exited, the guard at the gate nodded at me, and a smirk crept onto my face. Vivian was doomed to rot in there, just as planned. My father, having moved into cheap assisted living after the company failed, was reduced to sitting in an old armchair, staring at a blank TV. I found him, hands shaking as he tried to stand when he saw me. "I messed up, kid." "I'm sorry," he croaked. I remained still, arms crossed. "You chose them over me," I said evenly. "Where are they now, Dad?" He sank back, tears in his eyes. I held a torn family photo, me, Mom, and him, and ripped it in half. He flinched. Searching through his drawer, I found a letter addressed to me, yellowed and creased, from a week after that stormy night. It was his handwriting, apologizing for believing Vivian and urging me to come home. She must have intercepted and hid it for years. He wasn't purely evil, just a weak man under her influence. Holding the letter, I watched him sob. "I tried to fix it," he said, choking on the words, but I was too late. I paused, then dropped the letter and handed him a check to cover his bills. "Take care," I said, heading for the door. He pleaded for me to stay, but I kept going. Jack waited in the parking lot, leaning on his truck. I climbed in without looking back. A few months later, Dad passed away, alone, with his obituary barely making a paragraph in the local paper. That night, after leaving Dad, Jack stayed by my side, the gravity of everything hitting me. Vivian was locked away, Dad was gone, after 10 years of battles and rebuilding. Now it was over, and I didn't know my next step. Jack drove us back, city lights flashing past. We didn't speak much, just shared quiet, the engine humming. Inside, I kicked off my shoes, flopped on the couch, and stared upwards. Jack grabbed beers and joined me. "You did it," he said as he sat. "They're all gone." I nodded, sipping my drink. "So, why doesn't it feel better?" The weeks ahead felt strange. I returned to work, running the company, meeting clients, and signing contracts. The office bustled with people unaware of my past struggles, and I kept it that way. Jack stayed by me, handling numbers and keeping things light. One morning, he insisted on coffee instead of our usual meeting, and we sat at a cozy downtown spot, steam rising from our drinks. "You've been quiet," he said, stirring his coffee. "What's on your mind?" I shrugged, watching the street life outside. "Figuring out what's next," I replied. He leaned back, observing me closely. "You don't have to do it alone, you know," he said, catching my eye. Jack had been there through every fight, loss, and bruise. I'd never thought beyond this, but now, things felt different. Life adjusted to a new normal. I sold the Carter house after it foreclosed, using the funds to start fresh. IT wasn't a large amount, but using cash to create a scholarship for children from difficult backgrounds felt right. It turned something chaotic into something positive. Jack was instrumental in arranging it, staying up late with me to sort out the paperwork over takeout. One evening, as we sprawled across my living room floor, pizza boxes open, going through applications, He threw a file aside and observed me closely. "You're different now," he remarked, less angry. I smirked, biting into a slice. "Maybe I'm just exhausted." He laughed, shaking his head. "Nope, it's something else. You're starting to live again." I didn't disagree. He was accurate. Things were lighter, as if I'd finally released something burdensome. As summer arrived, Jack persuaded me to take a break. We drove to a cabin he'd rented by a lake a couple of hours from the city. The cabin had wooden walls and a creaky porch, but offered a breathtaking view that seemed endless. Our first day was spent fishing with cheap rods from a gas station, sitting on the dock. I caught a small bass and released it, laughing when Jack's line tangled in the weeds. That night, we built a fire in the backyard, its flames crackling as the sun sank below the trees. Leaning against a chair, sipping a beer, the warmth soothed my legs. Jack sat opposite, poking the logs with a stick. He'd been quieter than usual all day, like he was building up the courage to speak. Eventually, he set the stick aside and met my gaze, the fire's glow reflected in his eyes. "Evelyn," he began slowly, "I've been pondering this for some time." I tilted my head, attentive. He rubbed the back of his neck, a familiar nervous habit. "When I first saw you in that bar, I thought you were just another task, someone who needed help getting back on track. But as we spent more time together, I realized it was more than that." He took a breath. "I've witnessed you fought through hardships I wouldn't wish on anyone. You're incredibly strong, yet there's a kindness you rarely show. And somehow, along the way, I fell for you." I paused, surprised, my beer halting midair as he spoke. His words came out passionately. "At first, it seemed like a foolish attachment to my work, but it's not. I love you, Evelyn. I want to be with you, truly and long-term, if you'll have me." Placing the bottle down, my hands rested on my knees. Jack loved me, the guy who had dragged me out of dark places and believed in me when I had nothing. Here he was laying everything bare. Initially, I struggled to speak, having used anger as a shield, keeping others at a distance. But upon reflection, truly contemplating it, I realized Jack wasn't like Dad or Vivian or Ethan. He never abandoned me or asked for anything beyond my reach. He'd been my unwavering support. Perhaps beneath all the chaos, I'd felt something too. I looked at him, his face tense, anticipating my reaction. "You're serious?" I asked, maintaining a light tone. He nodded firmly, without hesitation. "Absolutely." I chuckled softly, shaking my head. "You're crazy, Jack." "But yes, I'll have you." His smile was wide as he crossed the fire to embrace me. Hugging him, feeling his jacket ruff against my cheek, a warm sensation settled in my chest, unlike anything I'd felt in a long while. We sat down again, closer now, the fire crackling between us. He took my hand, lacing his fingers with mine. "What's the plan?" he inquired. "We've got the entire weekend ahead." I squeezed his hand, glancing across the lake. "Let's just stay like this for a while," I suggested. "No battles, no schemes, just us." He agreed, leaning back with me, and we watched the stars emerge one by one. The next morning, I awoke to the smell of coffee brewing and Jack making pancakes on a tiny stove. We enjoyed breakfast on the porch, the air fresh and cool, and I realized I was smiling more than I had in years. Later, we hiked a nearby trail, winding through pines until reaching a spot with a scenic view of the water below. I paused, catching my breath, Jack at my side. "This is it," I announced, more to myself. What I'd been missing. He wrapped an arm around my waist. "You've got it now?" he asked. And he was right. The quest for revenge was over, the past laid to rest, and I had discovered something far better. Someone who saw every part of me and stayed. I was no longer feeling empty. I was happy. If this narrative resonates with you, show your encouragement with a like. And don't forget to subscribe to Revenge Story for more captivating tales of justice, betrayal, and redemption. We invite you to share your thoughts, leave a comment, and contribute your own stories. Every word you write strengthens our community, fostering sharing, healing, and empowerment. Stay tuned for more intense, thought-provoking stories coming soon. We aim to bring you the best narratives filled with emotion, drama, and the satisfaction of karma. See you in the next one.